Welcome again. This panel will focus on the economic growth, the impact of the pandemic, and the inequalities and the development, moderated by Michael Reid, but Michael Reid was not able to attend. So he'll be here virtually, so I will give him the floor. Michael Reid is a journalist from The Economist. He was an editor of the section of the Americas, The Economist. He's written 3 books, Forgotten Continent, about Latin America, another one about Brazil, and the third one will be published next year on Spain. The topic will be Spain.
Muchas gracias, Chris. Muchas gracias.
To Chatham House, Comexi, thank you for this invitation to participate in this very interesting conference. I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to attend personally because of my very tight agenda. I visited Mexico at the beginning of April, so I do not feel lost in this hybrid world of today. The technology enables us to hold this event in a mixed way, in a hybrid way. In regard to the topic of this session, the economic recovery and the growth in a very, very complicated scenario for Latin America and the rest of the world. The war in Ukraine is not only an unacceptable aggression and a humanitarian tragedy, but also a factor that brings economic imbalance and other imbalances brought about by the pandemic. And right after the war, the world economy will only grow 3.6 instead of 4.4%, according to the forecasts of the IMF. In regard to Latin America, macroeconomically speaking, it's recovering from the pandemic faster than we thought and faster than Europe. Many countries have already recovered their pre-pandemic economic level and have surpassed it and have exceeded it. That is the case of the main South American economies, but not the Mexican economy. In Latin America, the war seems very far away, but it is already hitting hard the prices of food, fertilizers, and energy, and this affects the most vulnerable sectors of society. In many countries, the annual inflation has reached 2 digits. The central banks have raised their interest rates since last year, and they have a difficult task ahead to control the inflation in a region with a story of great inflations. And now we're talking about Argentina and Venezuela, for instance, but they need to control the inflation in a situation of weakness. The core matter is going back to the old normality disguised by a new increase of the prices of the raw materials for the benefit of many economies in the region. The past decade was another lost decade with for Latin America, with an average growth, minimum average growth per capita per person in less in below the growth of the world economy, and now again faces an annual growth of 2.5 at most, which does not suffice to meet the needs and expectations of the Latin American peoples. The region is now stagnant with low productivity, poor innovation, and not enough exports, with some exceptions, such as Mexico. This is a serious situation because socially Latin America has not recovered fully from the pandemic. Employment, especially for women, and the wages are way below the thresholds of 2019, with more and more people working in the informal economy. Although the urgency assistance from governments uh, uh, made poverty get worse, the worst is yet to come with the impact of inflation. And also, there are areas in the education that will increase the inequalities. The colleges, the schools in Latin America were closed for 2 years, longer than the rest of the world except Asia. That is a silent scandal. That's outrageous. Many children in poor homes and households simply did not have the possibility to receive virtual classes. Uh, in effective terms, we have lost like 1.8 years of effective education in these social sectors. And the economic reprisal of Latin America goes along with social frustration and social claims and the dysfunction of the democratic political systems in many countries, nefarious trinity of issues that reinforce each other. Mexico in this scenario is a partial exception with the political and social unrest, but no juridical or legal stability as for and certainty for the investors. And outside, we have the impression that the economic performance of Mexico is far from being what it should be, and that the world situation of the world will make the rest of the term of President Obrador very complicated, as pointed out by the secretary. And delving further into this, we have a panel that is absolutely top notch and multi local. We have with you Jonathan Keyes, who is an economist with great experience, the vice governor from the Bank of Mexico, and then Andrés Velasco, former minister at the Ministry of Finance from Chile, now at the London School of Economics, leading a public policy institute, and currently in Dallas. And then Ms. Nora, a researcher, very well known in regard to inequalities, poverty, and injustice in Latin America for many years from the Tulane University in Louisiana, and currently leading her activities. Without any further ado, Jonathan Heath, you have the floor, sir. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you all. First, let me talk about the economic reprisal as such after the harsh fall in 2020 of 8.4, and taking into account the calendar effects. The economy was recuperating quite well, and half 2020 we got even surprised. We were doing well. We were on the right path to recover the lost terrain. However, going into 2021, we are faced by three factors that slowed down this recovery. And during most part of 2021, the economy went stagnant. The EGI peaked in March and then showed not even a lateral trend, I would say slightly going down. To such an extent that when the economy showed a negative rate around the third quarter, we were already debating whether we were going again into a recession. What happened? That's important to understand the perspectives. Onward. The first factor, the exports. The exports recovered in the second half of 2020, surprisingly, and in November 2020, we had already surpassed the pre-pandemic levels, and we had already a historic maximum peak. But then again, we launched into this great crisis with a great number of disruptions in the production chains globally, with the famous scantiness of semiconductors. However, that was important, but there were many inputs that went scarce, hit Mexico harder than any other countries because, as you know, the imported inputs in our exports is very high. And from then on, the exports went stagnant throughout 2021. And until the end of the year, November, December, February of this current year, which was an excellent month, we see the exports are getting up again and recovering. That's good because the exports are a crucial growth driver. When this engine's turning, we have the possibility to grow. That is the first good news for 2022. The second factor that hit Mexico very hard in 2021, we had two additional eruptions of the pandemic, two more flashes. So when we spoke about the recovery of services, which represent 2/3 of the economic activity, this recovery was tackled and went stagnant. The mobility rate went down again, and there were many issues trying to reactivate this sector that was stagnant. And now, a very idiosyncratic aspect of our country, I believe. At the end of the day, it could have been a good reform, but the timing was so poor, was the labor reform that banned all types of outsourcing in the country. Simply in the month of August, the sector where we find these types of companies, they crashed 32%, and again September, October, November, December. So the accrued crash, I don't remember exactly, but it goes over 75%.
This fact on its own led to more than a whole percentage point decrease to the gross domestic product in 2021. That was the first trimester, but even the second quarter, our perspectives for growth was to grow more than 6% even, and possibly even as much as 7%. We ended up having a growth rate of 5%. And these were the factors that led to this stagnation and that did not allow for us to grow any further and have there's some it seems that the pandemic is now receding. We have a green light in most of our states throughout we have had them for a while in most states of the country, and we are seeing a stark recovery in services, which is key. If this continues, then there's a second piece of good news for 2022. And the second piece of good news is that the negative effects of the labor reform, which was a correction intended to fix it once and for all, but which will dissipate with time and won't have the effect that it had back in 2021. The three factors that explain the stagnation of 2021, well, it seems that we will be getting over this. So why is everybody saying that we will not grow even at a rate of 2%? In principle, I would say that the key factor that will determine whether we grow below or over 2%, whether maybe we may be able to reach 3% as this government seems to foresee is private investment. Private investment hit its peak in 2015. It was stagnant for 3 years, started falling in 2019, plummeted in 2020. And the recovery that we have seen since then, I've seen that at best is mediocre. This has been, in good measure, a series of clashes between supply, which has been distorted in our economy and which explains this ongoing global spurts of inflation, which has also hit Mexico. It's true, Mexico's inflation would be 2-3 points higher if we had not had this policy of placing a ceiling, capping the price of gasoline. But it is, I would say, not standing out of control. The sub-index for food products is above 11% and is reaching 12%, and that is truly concerning because this is what hits people the most and the most vulnerable people the most. So how can we control inflation? What we're seeing in most recent polls is one of the factors that business people see as a limiting factor to growth for the foreseeable future, at least for the next 6 months. We have 3-4 elements. The first cannot truly be called an instrument, and it's just to be patient and hopefully get lucky. A little patience for production chains to get reestablished and to get lucky so that there are no further disruptions such as Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. We do have 3 tools that we can make use of. The first is our own tool, and it is our own monetary policy, which is fully within our own control. Notwithstanding, we do acknowledge that the channels through which this monetary policy is distributed are quite feeble. This is not an efficient tool to attempt to overcome shocks to supply. We do not have an over-demand in Mexico, as is clearly taking place in the United States, as Mr. Rogelio so clearly put it a few minutes ago. But we have to focus on that which is under our own control, and we will be making use of this in the measure that we can. We have to send a signal to exploit the channel for expectations, manage expectations, because when inflation hits, then the central bank does what it can. That happened in 2011, 2017, and we have to do the exact same thing now. We have to be coherent, and this does not imply any restrictive policy. Not going from an expansive policy to one of taking on debt. We have to be ever more aggressive. The second tool that we have is not under control of the bank, but it is under control of the federal government, which is the anti-inflation program, which has been announced here. I believe that it will be marginally useful, but it is not a solution. And we're seeing short-term effects here. I believe that, it'll be marginally useful, but it is not a full solution. And now we will talk about the third tool, which we have absolutely zero control over. It is exogenous, but it will be effective, and it is the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. What we need is for the Federal Reserve to start, for this policy to be applied, and for inflation in America to be put under control. Once that takes place, then that will set the ground for us to resolve our own issue. Most inflation that is taking place now comes from abroad, but we do have our own issues, very own issues that do contribute to this within the country. But I do believe that this is the most important part of the solution. Next is, well, what to do? What do we do? In the first place, I would say, well, we'll go to the Federal Reserve, and if we see that there's no response in terms of inflation rates here in the country, then maybe we can be even more aggressive than they are. But I would say that, for me, my personal opinion is that the Federal Reserve will set a base level for the trajectory of her monetary policy from here on out for a good long while. And if we look at this, we do have some headroom to raise our rates. Still, we are at a neutral level. I would say I think we should raise it 2, 3, 4 points at a bare minimum to have a restrictive monetary policy, which is consistent with the inflation rates that we see currently. And what we do have to be careful about is we have 600 points difference in comparison to the Federal Reserve, and we cannot. I do not see what people have been talking about, this out of sync situation. So we have to keep that difference, that delta, that 600, 625, even 650, depending on how we see inflation rates responding in Mexico. Inflation should hit its peak in the coming months and then begin a slow, hard, downward trend. And the most important factor here is, once again, hopefully we get lucky and we have no further unforeseeable shocks. We have lived through a long series of unforeseen events. Will that happen? Well, that's unlikely. No, the unforeseen is unforeseen. And, well, that's it. Thank you so much. I would like to, please allow me to remind everyone who is with us online that you may ask any questions using the Q&A function on your screen. And I now grant the floor to Andrés Velasco. Thank you. And thank you to Chatham House for the invitation. It is a great pleasure for me to be here sharing this virtual podium with my esteemed colleagues. This is a panel on economic topics, but I would like to share some thoughts of political in nature, if you would allow. In Latin America, it is almost impossible not to see the fact that a response to the pandemic was quite mediocre, if you allow the harshness. We had eighth of the highest countries with the highest per capita death rates are in Latin America. We're overrepresented in this regard at a global scale. And this has its consequences in the economy that we will be talking about this. This has its consequences on education, human capital, pay, equality. Mike talked about this. And in my opinion, this opens up a deeper question still. Why do we have such difficulty in governing ourselves in Latin America? And so many countries in the world have even less infrastructure. So many countries less wealthy than we are. Why then? We have an underlying political issue that is so important. This underlying problem, I believe, reminds us that there are at least two short-term limiting factors in terms of growth. And these are things that we cannot pass by. One of them is how fixed our economies are, how difficult it is to diversify, and the second is the lack of private investment. Jonathan mentioned this already. One of the reasons for which Mexico is finding it hard to grow after the pandemic is a lack of private investment, and the same thing could be said for Argentina, Colombia, Brazil, in my country, Chile, and a great many other countries in the region. And this cannot be seen independently from the stability of public policy in our region. And this has become a cliche. Clinton's head of campaign said, it's the economy stupid. And I think that in Latin America, I would say it's the opposite. No, it's the politics stupid. It's hard to understand local trends if we do not understand the limiting factors in terms of politics. Having introduced my point of view, having thus introduced my point of view, I would like to share some perspectives for the short term, the mid-term, and the long term, and how I believe that the politics of a region, public policy in our region, might well evolve into the future. I'll begin with the short term. This is not quite the perfect storm, given that there's one aspect that was held to a degree, which is the price of natural resources. But other than commodities, most aspects of the global economy bear ill news for Latin America. This crisis in terms of supply chains has lasted for more than anybody could have foreseen. Second, growth at economic growth at a global level post-pandemic was higher than we thought possible. But the rates, but the speed, the momentum before will not be recovered. I was at a panel here at Davos listening to Chinese authorities. The world in which China was growing at a 5, 6, 7% is done. You know, this world where there were several engines pulling us forth is done. We're facing steep hikes to interest rates in the United States of America, and it is true they started from extremely low rates and they are now reaching rates which could be deemed normal. Notwithstanding, if you recall, if you look at the history of emerging markets in the past 50 years, evermore, and I repeat, evermore, every single time that there was an interest rate hike globally, there was a financial crisis, a credit crisis in an emerging region, someplace, whether it was Latin America, parts of Africa, Russia, parts of Eastern Europe, whatever it may be. So a combination of low growth, international trade that is hindered, a steep rise in interest rates globally, but especially in the United States and Latin America. This places us at high risk, highly vulnerable to this. Some countries have less foreign debt. The banks are better regulated. Others have been growing at a higher rate since before. So they have better underlying conditions. But the global context, I fear, is not positive. And I would like to talk about this. Jonathan has talked about this in detail. We would have to add inflation to that. Inflation is bad for the economy, but inflation is also bad to people's pockets. When prices go up, pressure increases, and this tends to trigger reactions, public policy reactions that are not always good for long-term growth. And this, I believe, we should also be mindful of. And I fear, and I will say this in conclusion, in terms of short-term perspectives, and after 1 year of fast recovery, and I underscore this word recovery, when the economy falls 10 points but then recovers 8 points, it is not growing. As Mike said, we are only just getting back to our previous levels of activity, pre-crisis. But once that recovery is done, our perspectives for the future rather slow, which leads me to the second point, which is mid-terms, long-term perspectives. And this, I believe, is the key. Our region, and I underscore, has lost its ability for growth. The growth that we saw a decade ago, those of us who have been working in government, who've been working as ministers of the economy or whatnot, we might well say that yes, the economy grew because of our brilliant administration, but no, conditions have are the key conditioning factor here. The cycle of the favorable cycle in terms of commodities is done, and so our ability to grow for growth in Latin America is done. As many governments and the world credit for such countries is much lower than it was a decade ago. In Chile, what we used to do is we would lock people into a room, give them some food, give them some equations. Then they had to put some numbers into these equations and predict what the growth rate would be. These numbers from 10 years ago were at 5%. Now they are 2.5%, which is to say that Chile, the country which the country for many years with the highest growth rates in the region, lost more than half of its capacity for growth. And this is quite similar to other countries in the region. In Colombia, Peru, Panama is still growing. Guyana is growing at a 20% rate, which is due to its oil production. But throughout the region, this has been catastrophic. But our perspectives in the midterm for growth and generalized prosperity, I fear, are also mediocre. Yeah, growth is not sufficient for the happiness and tranquility of people, but growth is notwithstanding necessary, and growth, there's no growth in most countries in the region. Why are we growing at such low rates? And I would say to begin with that I do not have a clear diagnosis for Mexico, because given all of these ongoing reforms, why is Mexico's growth so slow? Now, what I can talk about is South America. South America was outside of value chains. We are not linked directly to the North American value chain or the European value chain, which are centered on the United States and Germany, nor the Asian value chain based in China. So our exports from Colombia, Peru, Argentina, Brazil, Chile are more or less the same as they were 10, 20, 30, 40, even 50 years ago. And yes, these products, how much can you grow? But if I have been producing apples for 50 years, Chile exports apples. Okay, maybe I can improve the ways I irrigate my trees, but there's a limit to growth in terms of productivity. So when you're selling apples, the way to escape that is to diversify. And this has been so hard for our region, and that's the reason that productivity has been stagnant, and the reason for which long-term growth has been stagnant. And without long-term growth, then there is no chance for sustained improvements to well-being. This is a reality which is upon us, and I will finish if I'm granted one more minute with a political reflection here. And this is more for South America and Central America than for Mexico. Our appetite in South America for economic reform of any kind, whether this be orthodox, traditional, or less traditional reforms. Take your pick. Take your pick. Political will for economic reform, the capacity for governments to implement such policies is non-existent. We have structural issues at a political level. South America has the trait, which is quite unique in the world, of having democratic regimes. So we elect the president for 4, 5, 6 years, 4, 5, 6 year terms, and we have proportional electoral systems. So the incentives there for the parliament to become atomized, for each party to be rather small, and for it to be practically impossible to create majority coalitions. This is the reality of Brazil, Colombia, Brazil, Chile, and so many other countries. The president in office, or if there's a second term, then they have 51%. They're elected on 51% vote. And then they go to Congress, and then they find out, as happened in Peru, that they have 10%, or in Ecuador 12% of votes in Congress. Or in Chile with President Boric, who has a minority even within his own coalition in both chambers. And therefore, he has no leeway to govern. This issue, this impossibility due to terrible political system design, there's no way to implement anything regardless of what the project may be. And given that it is impossible to do anything, then people say, well, this government promised this or that, and they lied. And this leads to our current situation where polling shows growing discontent, showing disaffection to political parties, and growing social ferment. This has socioeconomic repercussions throughout. What I would like to see in our region is public policy that allows us to govern and modify our economy to make it work. Thank you, Andrés, for your clear diagnosis of the issue of economic policy in the region, and I fully concur. And now I would add that the solution to the issue, solutions are extraordinarily difficult, but it all begins with policy. Mr. Lara here will be talking about the problem of education and certain other social issues. Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon. Let me begin by thanking Chatham House and Comexi for the invitation to participate in this panel. And as Andrés said, it is a pleasure to share it with Michael, Jonathan, and Andrés, with whom I've had an opportunity to work in many different contexts throughout the years. I will share some thoughts on what the implications of the pandemic may be in terms of inequality into the future. And I will give you first the broad strokes of what changed in terms of inequality in the region and what the changes may be into the future. In very generalized terms, inequality, if one looks at what happened starting back in the 90s, we can distinguish three main trends. In the 90s, inequality grew throughout the region, many countries in the region, and this was linked to pro-market trends, and this benefited people with the highest levels of education. In Latin America, after there was an unforeseen situation, there was a steep drop in inequality throughout the region across all indicators. And what has happened here is there have been two factors that led to that reduction. The first, and respectfully here, I will disagree with what Mr. Rogelio Ramirez said. One key element here was the introduction of focalized wealth transfer to the most vulnerable populations. This means 20% on average throughout the region. And the other very important aspect here is a drop, a third drop in terms of income. This steep drop was also linked. There was a relative drop in, those with highest education levels saw the steepest drop. And then there was increased access to education, especially in the 90s. Then at the start of this millennium, we have had a mixed situation. Inequality is still falling, for instance, in Central America, which I find very interesting. And I say interesting because we all know what's going on. And in others, it is growing, or it is not dropping at least. But there have been generalized. It's possible that each country is unique in its situation. It is hard to tell whether there is a generalized underlying factor here. But then the pandemic hit, and as we know, in most of these countries, the result was a growth in inequality, more poverty, except for Brazil, given its policy, which more than compensated for the effects of the pandemic. Funny enough, Mexico, and again, respectfully, I disagree with the minister here. Mexico is one of the countries that did not introduce compensation methods for for the poor, and given that pre-existent conditions provided some leeway there. Notwithstanding, it might have been convenient to introduce specific measures to mitigate such effects in Mexico. That is what happened up until the pandemic. Perspectives for mitigation of poverty and inequality. This is all closely linked to growth. So in the measure that the recovery is slower than we had foreseen, then, well, recovery in terms of poverty and inequality will also be hindered, especially for the least qualified segments of the population. But my main concern is what we have called the lasting scar of the pandemic, which is the impact in terms of access to education and the population's access, and especially for the children of poor families in terms of access to education. Because of the pandemic, this has already been mentioned, Latin America is the region which disproportionately has been most affected by the pandemic in terms of health, but also in terms of education. The highest closure rate for schools. UNESCO calculated that 97% of children in certain age groups did not go to school throughout 2020, and this went on into 2021. And how do we know what the capacity for compensating for that? Well, that depends on the family and their economic opportunity. Not all children have access to remote schooling, not only because the capacity for parents to help children to gain access to school online is very, very different. It's very different if your parents have high levels of education or not. So the seed of inequality has been zone here for the midterm, and I will share a chart with you, a couple charts, if you would allow, Michael, because I believe, as has been previously stated, that charts are very powerful in terms of sharing words, and oftentimes they're more powerful than words.
This is the curve for the region. What's happened in different times? Green, the probability, likelihood of completing high school for high-income households and for children with low-income households. So we needed to close the gap. So the process is quite welcome. Very important social progress in the region. So what happens with those who were born at the beginning of the year 2000, and they may be affected by the pandemic in their capacity to complete their high school and their school cycle. Okay, now with the dotted line, without the pandemic. The other line, a solid line with the pandemic. So what we're doing with these projections, what was amazing, 20 percentage points less for the children with a low revenue households and less likelihood that they will complete their high school. And per country, the case of Mexico here with the arrows, since we're in Mexico, but the red lines show the likelihood of finishing high school. No, light red and green, no pandemic. In darker colors with the pandemic. In red for children with low revenue households, and green children with a high income households. So for children living in poor households, the likelihood of finishing their high school, it varies. So the gap will be increased, and in average, we're seeing a fall of 20 percentage points in for children who live in low revenue households and minus 32% according to our forecast. And somehow this will take us to, we have a backwardness of 50 years that we're feeling today in regard to the education performance. If there's a fall in the inequalities, a reduction of inequalities in the year 2000, maybe it's a reverse process. And now that we see the increase in the equalities of the education, maybe we will increase the inequalities in the wages and then increase absolute inequalities. So this can have an effect in the growth in the entire region, in addition to all the other elements I mentioned. So we have these structural factors, and that can, of course, lead to greater inequalities and hit in a negative manner the growth, the economic growth. Now, there's an element that's very important in terms of public policies, that is to remediate this situation so that this fall does not become totally tangible, and to implement macroeconomic measures. The countries will need to implement austerity measures, especially in the realm of education, but also focusing the most vulnerable population and enable all the children that could be at risk of not finishing their education, that they may pursue their scholarity. And so I stop at this, and I hope we can start a debate in this regard. Well, prior to, of course, we will take questions. If you want to raise your hand, and I will present your question. Michael, I want to thank Nora. I'd like to talk about a great problem, insufficiently assessed in Latin America. It is a current issue, and it will become a major issue in years to come. I was surprised about this possibility, negative possibility, about these teachers' unions and parents of students and the lockdown of schools. I think we need to have a mobilization to tag resources and close the gaps in in the realm of education. Now, I know we can make questions, the audience can make questions. Before we get to that point, maybe, Jonathan, I was going to ask you to give us more details about the dilemmas of the monetary policy in Mexico. But you truly surprised me by answering with figures and numbers about the possible paths and curves of the interest rates. So here's an interesting question by Ricardo Smith Nieves from the Sustainable Human Development Institute, who's asking about the possibility of a recession, likelihood of a recession in the U.S. in 2023, and are Mexico and Latin America ready to meet this scenario? That has to do also with what Andrés said about the likelihood of seeing great financial stress in the region and worldwide. What do you think about that? Well, I believe currently the main issue is inflation right in front of us. So we first need to solve this issue, and before trying to look at a possible recession in the U.S. as in 2023. Right now, the likelihood is quite low. We still have a couple of years bearing a difficult inflationary issue that needs to be solved in future years. But this has to do with the reaction of the Federal Reserve. Reaction started way too late, too much too slow, if I may say so, and we're talking about a 0.75% inflation rate. Probably it'll reach 3. That's not a monetary that's not a necessary perspective, and this could induce a recession in the U.S. I don't picture that at all. Maybe the inflation would need to be very persistent in time. We would need to have a very aggressive reaction from the Federal Reserve, and talking about rates of 5, inflation rates of 5 and even more. I don't know, to actually start having a great possibilities of recession in the U.S. Andrés, since you're sitting there, now from Magic Mountain, we can you see Latin America, or you can't even see Latin America from the Magic Mountain? Do you even speak about Latin America? Well, very good question, Michael. Well, this has to do with a question people always ask when you go back to Latin America. Our friends from Chile, Argentina, Mexico. Well, what is being said about our country in Europe? And practically nothing. That's my answer. Of course, here in Davos, Latin America is represented. The president of Colombia is there. But let's be honest. Latin America is not our main interest. Latin America, let's say it this way, a region where our participation in international trade used to be more important in 1914, and if compared with today. And the Latin American countries in Davos attend with many other Latin American friends, so the environment, you're amongst friends. But I would lie, Michael. I would lie, Michael, if I told you that in that at one session focusing on Latin America, we have investors from all over the world. They'll say, well, where should I invest my money? Where's the next sector, the next economy that will emerge? None of that. You don't even hear about it. So this is a topic where I don't want to follow. Well, what I don't want to follow, it has to do with governance and the quality of the politics. But there's another reason, and I will digress with what Jonathan just mentioned. Yes, it's true that in the U.S. the economy is buoyant, and there's a far stretch for the U.S. to fall into a recession. But let me tell you about three things here. In the U.S., the inflation won't abate until the economy slows down. And if we look at the historical record, it is not, it's very unusual. It barely happens that the central bank, the Federal Reserve in the U.S., has such ability to make the inflation get down to zero without the economy without the economy getting into a recession. So first, yeah, maybe there'll be a recession, not just yet in the U.S. And if you ask me about what's being said in Davos, the consensus, I would even dare, a unanimous consensus is that eventually there will be a recession in the U.S. Two, the United States is not the world. The recession will happen in Europe. The great possibilities because Europe grew way before that. So part of lower flight and it'll get into a negative terrain. And I don't want to say there'll be a recession. I don't want to get into any negativity, but that happened already in the growth of China. And the other thing that's being said in Davos is a paradox of the Great Britain and Latin America Bank that are tightening, and the Bank of China is letting go because the lockdown was a sudden stop for the Chinese economy. So now they are letting go. And another question about Latin America. In that scenario, it is very likely that many of the economies in our region, after having grown a great deal, at least in the headline, although it was not a real growth from last year, and after growing a little bit this year, it is likely that many economies of the region will be at zero next year. I don't want to talk about Mexico because there are two Mexican citizens that are very well informed. They're experts in the panel, a lady and a gentleman. If I look at Brazil, Peru, Argentina, the economic forecasts are bad. So Latin America has not grown for a great many years. Our presence in the trade world is very low. If our issues of governance have only grown in recent years. And third, well, if we're a short distance from a recession, let's not be surprised if in the Magic Mountain people mention China, Africa, the green transformation, but very, very, very little about our region. Practically nothing said about Latin America. Can you introduce yourself? Ana Paula Rorica from Televisa. I want to raise this question is for Mr. Jonathan Heath. Andrés Velasco said he does not know why Mexico does not grow in spite of all the reforms that have been passed in the country. So I'd like to hear your take on that. And what's the Eurasia Group published a couple of days ago a graph about the food inflation in many countries: Russia, Vietnam, South Korea, Brazil, Mexico. And Mexico is the second country with a greater inflation until March 2022, 12.8, and Russia 17.9. That's the first country. But I'm amazed that Russia, that is leading this invasion, not a war, is in first place and ranked first, and then Mexico, and then Brazil at 11.6. So why Mexico has such high inflation? Because we're not participating in the war as Russia is. Well, first, why Mexico has not grown? Well, for the most part, because of the factors Andres mentioned, can be applied here. No doubt about that. We've had issues of governance, issues in regard to the rule of law for a great many years also. It's been a chronic factor, but I'd like to point out two situations. From public investment reached a peak in 2009 and then went for 11 consecutive years showing negative rates. 11 negative years going down, and the first positive rate in public investment was seen last year, but on such a very low basis that if they fixed a pothole in the street, it would have been a positive sign. It's been such a crisis, the fall of public investments. And if my memory doesn't fail me, but more than 10 years ago, it used to be 35% of the total investments, and now it doesn't even reach 15%. If the public sector is not investing in the necessary infrastructure that they need to complement to draw the private investments, we can hardly think that the public investors will respond. Then we've seen that the private investments reached a peak in 2015 and has not grown ever since because of a lack of complementarity, because we haven't had any public investments to draw them, and then an accrual of shocks with a number of unknowns for this country. And in 2015, it was clear that a president would get to the U.S. that did not like Mexico, that they would see Mexico as a bunch of rapists, of burglars, and he wanted to build a wall so that nobody could even look at Mexico. And so this really injected a great amount of doubts, questions. The investment stopped. And that man wanted to destroy everything. That man wanted to bring down the first World Trade Agreement, free trade agreement in history. I'm quoting the man. So that put the private sector in standby, then many other things. Imagine, I don't know how many billions in the airport, all of a sudden it's canceled, or the Constellation beer plant in Mexicali is canceled, and one after the other here. Well, we must invest. Investing in Mexico is no business, so better not invest anything. So now, with the fact that we have a new free trade agreement that was renegotiated, Trump left. Well, he's threatening to come back, and we still have some unknowns. Last survey carried out by the Bank of Mexico with the economy experts, only 8% of the respondents say that it is a good time to invest. The majority say that they don't know, and they say that it would not be the right time to invest. And without the engines of investment, the country will not grow. Period. So that's where we should start looking at the situation. Why Mexico has the highest food inflation than any other country? Well, truth is, it's hard to answer that. The only thing I can say is that for the past 6 years, the food and beverage sub pricing sub-indexing has been always going up because of when we compare Mexico with other countries, we have greater lobbying in Mexico. So when the prices go up exactly the same amount in Mexico, the inflation will be hit because of this lobbying. There are many, many explanations that I can list, but at the end of the day, they are marginal comments. And maybe it's a lack of competitiveness in these sectors that regroup the processed foods. There's an inelastic demand for these foods. And the example, for instance, restaurants, they really raise their prices in an outrageous manner. And they're always full of people. So the message is that they can raise their prices, no issue. So why stop at that? They just keep adding zeros, no? So that's part of a very complex problem. We're trying to understand that every day, but these are only hypotheses I can present to you. So we have a question, Michael, and I wanted to ask Nora, in this context of very low growth, null growth in years to come, there are requests for greater public expenditures. For instance, in education, we need to spend more in order to close the gap. In the world where the expenditures go up, the service of the debt will cost even more. But there are requests throughout the region for more universal social policies, a network, a very robust public assistance network. So in that context, which public policies, and bearing in mind the previous comments regarding the success of the money transfer programs, what should the priorities be in regard to poverty and inequalities, in regard to the public investments? Well, this is a great question. I always reach a conclusion. Why Mexico doesn't grow? Oh, mystery. So the only way we economists can explain it is that we need to tackle this issue with a very moderate, humbled manner, because it's been over 30 years that we've seen this situation in Mexico, why it doesn't grow. Now, regarding the priorities, that at least the budgets should not be cut down in education, health services, not only invest more, but to have some intervention methods. It's not only in regard to the public sector. I am highlighting it, the private sector, the for-profit and NGOs can play a very important role. And so this would be a crusade to remediate the confinement, closing down the schools, and everything I mentioned during the intervention. In regard to transfers, there are elements that make universal programs extremely attractive. They have no stigmas. They're always there. So they're a sturdy floor that give a general access, always available. But we've undertaken some assessments, we can have universal transfers, and the scope could suffice to combat poverty, but we do not need collection or recollection elements that would end up being much too heavy. What we are proposing is to keep the transfers well focused. Not what happened in Mexico. The transfer should still be an element of the public policies, and then introduce the concept of a universal contingency rent in regard and to be able to face negative shocks in order to implement the beneficiaries and the benefits and multiply them swiftly. During the pandemic, some countries managed to do that, and let's look at the mechanisms in order to be able to have a universal intervention whenever necessary, and that happens when we have a systemic shock like the one we had during the pandemic. And we can also talk about mechanisms to deal with the increase of the price of the food. You give everyone a money guarantees. There's much to poverty and inequalities in Latin America that have not stopped growing. So we have a question from Ambassador Benjamin. Mr. Benjamin, Ambassador from the United Kingdom, and a question for my friend Andrés Velasco. A pleasure to greet you. Tell us more about the possible impact of the war unleashed by Putin, by Mr. Putin. This expertise, the supply of wheat, fertilizers has been going down considerably, but it seems that this conflict will go on for quite a while. What can the fallout be? And also seen from Davos, where you find yourself now, but for what will be the implications for Latin America?
Thank you, John. Such a pleasure, and congratulations for the job in Mexico, and flowery and spiny Mexico, as Pablo Neruda used to say. In Davos, there is talk of not else other than this conflict, and the implications are vast and broad. I will start at a global scale and then hone in on the region. First is that this war, this terrible aggression from Russia, confirms that the world has changed and that the rules are worth very little. And Milton Friedman said something that I shall remember forever, and he said that the key factor for the world economy in the past 5 years is the fact that Russia's president, China's president, and America's president tried to become presidents for life. If you would usually hear that said of China or Russia, but for America that is not common, and there may be a slight exaggeration there, but it's still not revealing. And it shows how even advanced countries such as the United States have changed. And this generates uncertainty, volatility, and will on the part of investors to put a hole in the desert or build a plant here or there is almost gone. And that is terrible for the world economy and the consequences of that, we all know. Russia and the Ukraine play an important role in the production of grain in the world. That has not stopped, but it is now very hard to export. Ukraine cannot ship its grain via its ports, given that Russia has control of most of them. Russia does export grain, but it is exporting far less. The second immediate shock is the shock to the prices of energy. And there are two key points here. The prices of oil went up, but that'll be less lasting because the oil that Russia does not sell to Germany, they sell it to China or whomever else. Gas is fungible because it is moved via pipelines or GNL terminals, and there are a great many throughout the world. So the European Union places a full embargo on Russian gas, and I think it would be minimally decent for them to stop subsidizing with the money Russia and its aggression. That would reduce the global supply, and that may have long-standing effects. And then the shock of food prices and oil prices has had the effect of contracting the global economy. And then if we add to that the contraction in terms of supply, given lockdowns in China and difficulties in supply chains and issues with shipments from China and so on and so forth, in sum, the result is a terrible shock to supply worldwide. That production has been reduced, and that is bad from every possible point of view. I will talk now from the point of view of Chile. I'm not an expert in geopolitics. I'm not an expert in the economic policy of Europe or Russia. But what I hear here at Davos would suggest that this will go on for a long time to come. Because on the one hand, Russia will not win this war, or it is becoming harder. The inefficiency of Russia's army has been quite a surprise. The low morale of their troops, and therefore the initial prediction that Russia would take Kiev soon, well, that did not happen. On the other hand, Russia has been forced to concentrate its efforts on the eastern part of the Ukraine. But at the same time, Russia's army will not be, it will be lodged within the Ukraine for a long time to go. So there will be a standstill situation. So the concomitant uncertainty shall continue. Supply chains will adjust, and the price of food and energy will slowly, gradually come back down. But the alteration to the world global structures will subsist for a long time to come. So we have to be prepared for a long-standing and painful period of shock. We have to finish at 10:30. Any questions? Otherwise, may we, Michael? We have a question here. Thank you, Jonathan. Could you be more specific as to why not unlink Mexico's economy from the Fed? Could you explain that? Because, well, you're the authority there. Well, we have always been linked to the Federal Reserve, and if we look back in history, we see that when they go up, we go up. When they go down, we go down. And most people would have to. The difference is the rate at which this is done. If we look at rates as of December 2015, the first time we went up is because they went up, and then whenever they went up, we have followed. We have even been more aggressive than they have been. The delta was 300 points, and we went up to 575, and we have never been able to fully decouple the delta in terms of rates for both countries has the objective of compensating for the risk of investing in pesos instead, not in dollars, and incentivize the flow of funds into Mexico, or at the very least to mitigate capital losses. If we look at what has taken place in the past couple of years, we see that we have seen a net loss of resources, specifically in our investment protocol, and there's been a significant drop in foreign investment in M bonds, but surprisingly, the interest rate has remained relatively stable, and we have to be very mindful of that, because if this does not hold, then that will impact the exchange rate, and that there's been an impact on D instruments and other types of instruments. And this, there's been a remarkable growth in remittances and other factors that have compensated for that. Up to now, I think we have been lucky, because when M bonds go down up to this point without a need for an adjustment in exchange rate, well, that reduces our vulnerability in the long run. And in the face of the possibility of economic instability at a global scale that could be coming, that could be around the corner, what be around the corner, and that reduces our vulnerability to any such situation. But we do need that buffer, that delta in terms of rates, and we cannot go beyond a certain level. Going beyond that, well, it would be equivalent to a situation where they reduce the rates, but we don't. We will not lower our rates. We won't have a more expansive policy in the face of what is going on in the world. We will be slightly more restrictive in absolute and relative terms. In relative terms, we're closer to where we should be, and so this is mitigating the effect of that. But we do have to grow that in absolute terms. We have been somewhat lucky so far, because if they go up, then we have a chance to adjust accordingly, keeping our delta intact. And I believe that this is what we have to do at this time. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you. We are almost at the end. It's been such an interesting discussion, or two discussions, maybe three, on Latin America, the world, and Mexico, which is what this is all about. I have two comments. The first is to read a comment that we got from Roberto Ojeda. It is notable that in talks from public servants yesterday and today, no reference has been made of issues in Mexico around discrimination to women in education, health, and so on and so forth. Especially in economics. And if this does not change in Latin America will not be able to reach its true potential. We have not learnt our lesson yet. And this has shed some light on the importance of this topic. I have two brief comments in closing. First is that I think it is very important that the Mexican Central Bank is committed to doing its fundamental job, which is mitigating inflation, controlling inflation, because we know that in Latin America, inflation is a highly corrosive phenomenon. It has social and political, highly negative impacts in terms of inequality, so that's how it should be. And this brings us the question of whether beyond the possibility of recovery this year, this restrictive monetary policy is compatible with a 6% growth rate in Mexico, and I suspect that it may not be. I hope I'm wrong. And second, as to the other topic here on Latin America, we should acknowledge that in the last decade, global conditions were favorable to Latin America, maybe not as much as the 2000s, but it was highly favorable nonetheless in the past few years in terms of having cheap money throughout the world. And after, and there was reasonable growth rates throughout the world. And now, as has been mentioned, we are at a time where it'll be much harder. Global conditions will not contribute to that. And so we have to do, it will be difficult. It'll be hard for policy and politics to be more pragmatic, less utopian, and more focused, so that we may build the conditions to attain growth rates in the region that makes everything, this makes absolutely everything easier. Inclusion, reductions in poverty, and this makes it easier to continue with our reforms. And I thank all three panel speakers for highly stimulating contributions here. And I thank my co-moderator here, and I grant the floor to you. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you, everybody.